You've been walking for 2 days, and the milk you're carrying isn't in a jar. It's in a pouch made from an animal's stomach, tied at the top, slung over your shoulder in the heat. When you finally stop to drink from it, something's wrong. It doesn't pour anymore. You open it anyway. Inside isn't liquid. It's something thick, broken into soft white lumps, sitting in a pool of watery liquid that smells sharp, almost sour. Your first thought isn't curiosity. It's loss. That milk took real effort to get, and now it looks ruined, spoiled, wasted after 2 days of carrying it. Would you throw it out? Most people assume that's exactly what happened, over and over, for generations, until someone finally got lucky. That assumption isn't quite right, and the real explanation involves something you're already carrying, something built directly into the very container holding that milk. Think about your actual options here, standing in the heat with a pouch of something that clearly isn't milk anymore. Dump it out and lose everything. Or do something that feels genuinely reckless. Taste it. Nobody told you this was safe. Nobody's tasted anything like it before, at least not that you know of. The smell alone is enough to make most people hesitate, and hesitation, in this exact moment, is the only thing standing between you and finding out whether this is food or poison. What would actually convince you to take that first bite? Hunger? Curiosity? Simple desperation? Because walking 2 more days with nothing else to eat suddenly feels worse than the risk in front of you. Keep that question in mind, because whatever answer someone actually landed on, thousands of years ago, changed what humans eat permanently. And the full explanation for why that pouch didn't just spoil is stranger and more useful than almost anyone expects. Before we get to what was actually happening inside that pouch, it helps to understand why anyone was carrying milk in an animal's stomach in the first place. Because that detail isn't random at all. Animal stomachs made genuinely practical containers for ancient herding communities. They were naturally waterproof, flexible enough to carry without cracking, and, unlike a clay container, essentially free, made from an animal that had already been used for meat and hide. Using every part of an animal wasn't sentimentality. It was survival efficiency, and a cleaned, dried stomach happened to be an excellent vessel for liquid. Nobody chose this material because of what it would eventually do to milk stored inside it. They chose it because it worked, because it was already available, because a group living off livestock had these pouches on hand constantly for carrying water, blood, and yes, milk, across long distances between grazing areas and camp. Now picture the actual moment a little more closely. You're not alone. A small group is with you, equally tired, equally aware that food has been thin the last few days. Someone glances at what you're holding. The question isn't really whether you'll try it, it's whether you'll try it first, or whether someone else will. A different member of the group reaches for it before you do, examining the texture between his fingers, smelling it carefully, hesitating exactly the way you did a moment ago. This is where the story usually gets told wrong, and it's worth stopping here for a second. Most retellings treat this as a single dramatic moment, one person, one bite, one lucky discovery that changed everything instantly. Real behavioral change almost never works that way. This likely happened dozens, maybe hundreds of times independently across different groups, before it became something anyone trusted enough to do on purpose. Here's the part that actually explains what was happening, and it has nothing to do with luck or magic. The inner lining of a young ruminant animal's stomach, from an animal that had been properly slaughtered for meat, naturally contains an enzyme still used in cheesemaking today. One that causes milk proteins to clump together and separate from the surrounding liquid. Milk stored in a stomach-lining pouch wasn't simply sitting there passively. It was in direct, constant contact with a biological substance actively transforming it, hour after hour, throughout the entire journey. What you were carrying wasn't spoiled milk. It was milk in the process of becoming something else entirely, something with a name today: cheese. If this part surprised you, that the very container being used to carry milk was quietly cooking up an entirely new food the whole time, without anyone intending it or understanding why, sit with that for a second. Because it means one of humanity's most widespread foods began as a packaging accident nobody could have predicted. Now think about how strange that first taste actually would have been, with zero framework for what was happening. The texture alone was unlike anything milk had ever been. Solid where it used to be liquid. A completely different smell. A tang that raw milk simply didn't have. And it didn't make anyone sick. That detail mattered more than almost anything else in this entire story. Archaeologists have found genuinely solid physical proof that this wasn't just a rare, isolated accident, but became a deliberate, repeated practice remarkably early in human history. Researchers studying pottery fragments recovered from sites in the Kujavia region of what is now Poland identified perforated ceramic vessels, essentially strainers, dating back roughly 7,500 years. With milk fat residues still detectable inside the tiny hole, perforated pottery only makes sense for one specific purpose: separating solids from liquid. These weren't random cooking pots. They were purpose-built tools for draining curds away from whey, meaning by this point, people weren't simply stumbling onto transformed milk by accident anymore. They were actively recreating that transformation on purpose, using tools designed specifically to do it. This is where the story shifts from accidental discovery to genuine invention, and the distinction matters. An accident happens once or randomly, without anyone controlling it. A strainer built specifically for separating curds from whey means someone had already figured out the underlying pattern well enough to reproduce it reliably, on purpose, again and again. A man kneels beside a ceramic strainer, pouring thickened, curdled milk through it, watching pale liquid drip steadily through the small holes, while soft white solids stay trapped inside. He's done this before. His hands move with the kind of ease that only comes from repetition, not discovery. Now think about this for a moment. If your entire understanding of why this works came only from watching it happen repeatedly, with zero concept of enzymes, bacteria, or biology as fields of knowledge, how confident do you think you'd actually feel teaching someone else to do it correctly? There's a physical detail about this transformation that deserves real attention here, because it explains why this discovery mattered so much beyond simple novelty. Raw milk spoils fast, especially in warm climates, becoming genuinely dangerous to drink within a day or two under the wrong conditions. The transformed version, what we now call cheese, behaved completely differently. Once curds were separated from the liquid whey and allowed to dry somewhat, this new food lasted dramatically longer than raw milk ever could, in some cases stretching from a single day of usability into weeks. Particularly once ancient people also began adding salt to the process, drawing out additional moisture and further slowing the growth of anything that might spoil it. This means the accidental transformation happening inside that stomach pouch wasn't just an interesting curiosity. It solved one of the most persistent problems facing any group that relied on milk-producing animals. How do you actually use milk before it goes bad, especially during seasons when animals were producing more than a group could possibly drink fresh? Picture a small herding community moving through a particularly productive season. Animals producing far more milk daily than anyone could consume before it spoiled. Without some way to preserve that surplus, most of it would simply go to waste, a genuine loss during exactly the kind of season a group should have been thriving. Turning that surplus into cheese changed the entire calculation. Suddenly, abundance didn't have to be wasted just because it couldn't be consumed immediately. It could be transformed into something that waited, patiently, ready to be eaten weeks later during leaner stretches when fresh milk wasn't as readily available. There's another detail here that connects directly to human biology in a way most people never consider. Many adult humans, throughout most of history and still today across large parts of the world, lose much of their ability to properly digest lactose, the natural sugar found in milk, once they move past early childhood. Drinking large amounts of raw milk as an adult in these populations could cause real digestive discomfort. Cheesemaking changes this equation significantly. The fermentation and curdling process involved in traditional cheesemaking breaks down a substantial portion of the lactose originally present in milk. meaning the finished product was often far easier for lactose-sensitive adults to actually digest comfortably compared to drinking the same amount of milk in its original liquid form. This detail likely mattered enormously for early dairy herding communities, whether or not anyone understood the biological reason behind it. A food source that caused discomfort in its raw form became genuinely usable once transformed, effectively unlocking an entire category of nutrition that might otherwise have remained limited to only the youngest members of a group. Researchers studying ancient DNA have traced a related genetic shift directly tied to dairy consumption. The specific mutation, allowing some adult humans to continue digesting lactose comfortably throughout life, appears spread significantly within populations that had a long, sustained history of dairy herding and consumption, suggesting a genuine evolutionary relationship between this dietary practice and the human body adapting to it over many generations. Now think about that connection for a moment. A packaging accident involving an animal's stomach may have quietly influenced not just what ancient humans ate, but the actual genetic makeup of entire populations over thousands of years. A level of long-term biological impact almost nobody associates with something as simple as cheese. Not every community discovered or adopted this practice at the same pace, and that gap likely shaped daily life very differently across different groups. Communities that raised sheep, goats, or cattle, and therefore had regular access to both milk and the stomachs of young animals, had a genuine, repeated opportunity to encounter this transformation. Communities without regular access to dairy animals simply never had the raw materials necessary to stumble onto this discovery at all. This means the spread of cheesemaking wasn't uniform or inevitable. It depended entirely on whether a specific group's way of life happened to put milk and animal stomachs into contact with each other regularly enough for someone to eventually notice and trust the pattern. There's a detail about regional variation worth sitting with here, because it shows this wasn't a single invention that spread outward from one location. Different climates and different available animals meant cheese made in one region likely looked, tasted, and behaved noticeably differently from cheese made somewhere else entirely, even though the underlying biological mechanism, curdling triggered by stomach enzymes, remained essentially the same everywhere it happened. A community in a hot, dry climate faced different challenges preserving cheese than a community in a cooler, more humid region. Groups likely developed their own specific techniques for salting, drying, or aging their cheese based entirely on trial and error suited to their own local conditions. Meaning the earliest forms of cheese across different regions were probably far more diverse than any single, simple origin story usually suggests. Someone within a community who consistently produced cheese that tasted good, kept well, and didn't make anyone sick likely earned real, practical respect for that skill. This wasn't formal expertise in a modern sense. It was reputation built entirely through repeated, reliable results, the same way trust in any critical survival skill gets earned within a small, tightly connected group. A younger man watches an older member of his community carefully press curds into a simple mold, salting the surface with practiced, confident hands. He's watched this exact process many times before. He doesn't yet fully understand why the salt matters, or why some batches turn out better than others, only that this specific man's cheese reliably tastes right and reliably lasts. Skill transfer here likely happened almost entirely through direct observation and repeated practice, rather than any formal explanation. A young person learning to make cheese wasn't handed a set of written instructions explaining enzymes or bacterial activity. He learned by watching exactly how much salt got added, exactly how long curds sat before draining, exactly what the right texture felt like between his fingers, absorbing an enormous amount of practical knowledge without ever needing to understand the underlying science behind any of it. If this part surprised you, that an entire complex food production skill could be reliably passed down for generations with zero written instruction and zero scientific understanding, that's worth sitting with for a moment. because it reveals just how much sophisticated human knowledge existed purely as demonstrated practice, invisible to any historical record, beyond the physical evidence it eventually left behind. Failure in this process carried real consequences too, and that pressure shouldn't be underestimated. Curdled milk handled incorrectly, left too long in the wrong conditions, or exposed to genuinely harmful contamination, rather than the specific enzyme responsible for proper curdling, could actually become dangerous, rather than simply becoming cheese. Learning to distinguish between milk that was transforming correctly and milk that was actually spoiling in a harmful way was a genuinely important skill, refined only through repeated experience, almost certainly. Some very unpleasant early mistakes along the way. This distinction between beneficial transformation and genuine spoilage likely took real time and real trial to fully understand, even informally. Groups that developed a reliable sense for this difference gained a genuine survival advantage over groups that hadn't yet worked out the pattern clearly, since a failed batch handled incorrectly wasn't simply wasted food. In the worst cases, it could make someone seriously ill. Weather and season likely influenced this entire process significantly, adding another layer of complexity ancient cheesemakers had to navigate without any formal understanding of why. Warmer temperatures generally sped up the curdling process considerably, sometimes making it happen almost too quickly to control properly, while cooler conditions slowed it down, requiring more patience but often producing more consistent, controllable results. A community likely adjusted exactly when and how they attempted cheesemaking based on the specific season, learning through repeated experience, which times of year produced the most reliable results. Entirely through pattern recognition built across many attempts, successes, and failures, rather than any formal understanding of temperature's actual effect on enzyme activity. Trade likely emerged around this discovery, relatively naturally once it became a consistent, reliable practice within a community. Cheese, unlike raw milk, could actually survive being transported over real distances without spoiling immediately, meaning it became something a community with surplus dairy animals could genuinely offer to groups without the same access, creating a new category of valuable, exchangeable goods that simply hadn't existed before this transformation was understood. Picture two separate communities meeting, one bringing dried meat and worked tools, the other bringing aged cheese wrapped carefully for the journey. Neither side needs to understand the biology behind what they're trading. They only need to understand that this specific food, unlike fresh milk, actually survives the trip, and that alone made it genuinely valuable in a way raw milk never could have been. There's one more detail worth sitting with before we close this out. Whoever first tasted that transformed milk inside an animal's stomach pouch, whoever decided, in that exact uncertain moment, that hunger or curiosity outweighed the very real risk of eating something completely unfamiliar, left absolutely no record of who he actually was. No name. No story beyond the discovery itself, and the millennia of cheese-eating cultures that quietly followed. That's genuinely true of most foundational human discoveries. The individual disappears completely from history. What remains is only the practice itself, refined, adapted, and passed forward across countless generations, long after anyone could possibly remember whose specific hesitation, whose specific decision to taste something uncertain, actually started the entire tradition in the first place. Children growing up in dairy-herding communities would have absorbed the basic rhythm of cheesemaking early, likely well before they understood any of the reasoning behind it. Watching milk poured into a stomach pouch, watching curds separated through a strainer, watching salt worked carefully into a fresh batch, taught an unspoken lesson about transformation and patience long before any formal explanation of enzymes or preservation was ever necessary or even possible. A young boy watches curds being pressed into a simple mold, fascinated by how something that started as ordinary milk had become this entirely different substance in his hands. He doesn't understand the mechanism. He understands, with complete clarity, that milk can become something else entirely, and that this transformation, however it actually worked, reliably produced food his family depended on. Not every early cheese looked anything like what we'd easily recognize today. Some early versions were almost certainly soft, crumbly, and relatively short-lived compared to modern aged cheeses, closer to fresh curds than a hard, sharply flavored wheel meant to last for months. The long aging processes that eventually produced dramatically different textures and flavors likely developed gradually, refined slowly across countless separate attempts over an enormous span of time. This means the cheese most people picture today, sharp, hard, deeply flavored, aged for months or years, represents an enormous amount of accumulated refinement built on top of that original, much simpler discovery. A discovery that began with something closer to soft curds separated from watery liquid, sitting inside a stomach pouch nobody had originally intended to transform anything at all. So the next time you eat a piece of cheese without thinking twice about it, remember that this exact food began as a mistake nobody meant to make milk left too long inside the one container that happened to change it completely. Discovered by someone brave enough, or hungry enough, to taste something that looked and smelled nothing like what he expected. The container is gone. His name is gone. But the transformation he trusted enough to actually eat is sitting on tables across the entire world tonight, working exactly the way it always has.